Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Tank Encyclopedia YouTube channel. The following article is being read for you by many miles away. I hope you enjoy. Today we will be covering the 15-17 cm Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug. The Maus is probably one of the most recognizable tanks ever made. Despite only 2 hulls ever being finished, the entire history of the development, design, testing, and construction of the heaviest tank ever built is a long and convoluted one stretching from early concepts in 1941 to a finished and operational vehicle in 1945. At nearly 200 tons, the Maus was an enormous machine, more than double the weight of any other tank, and as such is often the butt of scorn for being too heavy or a waste of resources. Such criticism, though, is belied by the technical achievement in making this machine move under its own power and producing a vehicle with armor almost beyond the ability of any Allied tank-mounted weapon to penetrate. Of course, no tank can operate independently, and wars are not fought and won by single tanks. So ideas of one-on-one tank comparisons between the Maus and something like a Sherman are not only fruitless and pointless, but also completely disingenuous. Certainly, the Maus was not a military success. It saw no combat, and was indeed the recipient of a lot of time and effort which could have been spent elsewhere in the German war effort. It may come as a surprise, therefore, that despite just 2 hulls and 1 Maus turret for the Maus being finished, it was proposed to use it as a base for another vehicle. Almost every German tank from the Panzer I onwards served as either a platform for an anti-tank gun or self-propelled gun. These vehicles were combat-proven to be effective and were easier and cheaper to make than turreted tanks. It should be no surprise, therefore, that even the Maus project touched on this area at one point. The story of this improbable idea dates to May 1944. An ever-popular topic with model and game companies are the what-ifs of German tank evolution in World War II, and, with few exceptions, most tanks received a tank destroyer version. That is, that the hulls were repurposed for the mounting of a fixed superstructure on top with a forward-facing gun. The Maus too followed this direction with a very short-lived concept from May 1944. The Maus project had actually already been cancelled in November 1943 following severe production delays thanks to the Allied bombing of Krupp's factory in August of 1943. Despite this, the idea of restarting the Maus production program was being pushed by Dr. Porsche in March of 1944, and he continued to press for this through the summer of 1944 respectively. Whilst the Maus program was finally re-killed in July 44, with an order to scrap the remaining unfinished hulls 3 to 6, there had been a meeting held on the 9th of May of 44, which had offered some prospect of continuing Maus-related work. At that meeting, representatives from Porsche and Krupp met to discuss a new heavy type of self-propelled gun. This design was to revolve around the possible mounting of a 15cm L63 gun or the 17cm L53 gun on a heavily armored chassis to create a new heavy Sturmpanzer based on the Maus. Krupp, as before, would have responsibility for the production of the armor and fabrication of the hulls, obviously not the turrets, as this would be a casemate type vehicle, with Porsche being the design lead for the vehicle in general. Together, Porsche and Krupp had been 2 elements in the trio of firms which had produced the Maus, the third being Alket, which had the responsibility for the assembly of the Maus. It is a fair assumption, therefore, that had this Maus-based vehicle ever gone ahead, Alket would once more have been given responsibility for assembly. The entire vehicle concept was intended to be a competitor to the similar idea based on the hull of the E100 being developed at that time by the rival firm of Adler. The idea might, in hindsight, seem impractical or even absurd to the casual viewer, but this was not the case for Porsche and Krupp. They had met on the 9th of May, and clearly, from that meeting, it was felt that this idea of using Maus hulls for this type of vehicle was a viable prospect. So much so, in fact, that a follow-up meeting was held on the 17th of May to discuss what the new superstructure casemate for this Maus-hulled Sturmgeschütz would look like. This vehicle would therefore be known, depending on which gun was mounted, 15 or 17 cm Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug. In English, 15 or 17 cm assault gun on Maus vehicle. It was during this meeting that Krupp were adamant that they only wanted to use the 15cm L63 cannon, presumably because of the weight and size of the 17cm L53 and its ammunition. Krupp were obviously being very serious about the significant challenge to fit this enormous gun onto an admittedly enormous chassis, but one which was already crammed full of automotive components and where any available space inside the lower hull was used for ammunition storage. However, Dr. Porsche, it seems, was slightly less realistic and completely ignored the enormous size of the machine once more. Just as he had done with the original Maus turret development, he proposed a secondary turret mounting a 3cm anti-aircraft gun, 3cm Flakturm, to provide air defense for the vehicle. This idea was immediately discounted, as the vehicle would be escorted by air defense vehicles, would be out of gauge for travel by rail, and would interfere with the breach of the main gun. That idea was not accepted, and nor was the Porsche Krupp plan for using the Maus hull design either. The hull was too high and too heavy compared to the E100 hull. Instead, Krupp were contracted to produce a model for a 17cm gun-carrying design based on the E100 chassis instead. With that contract, issued on the 28th of May 1944, there was literally no reason for Krupp to continue working on a Maus proposal, and the idea was dead. As it turned out, the E100-based idea did not fare much better either. If there were any lingering doubts on the matter, both concepts were over by the middle of the year after a meeting with General Guderian, where he was shown the models. Guderian already disliked the Maus, and had tried to kill the project by cancelling all serial production. So the likelihood that he would agree to a new and heavier vehicle based upon the one he already disliked was exceptionally unlikely. As could be expected, no further discussions or work on the project took place after this. Therefore, in total, this most unlikely of projects lasted from the 9th of May to no later than the 28th. 19 days in which to consider what a poor design choice it would be regardless of any consideration of what purpose this enormous vehicle was going to be put to. No drawings of the ideas from Krupp or Porsche survived for this project, if indeed anything more than a sketch was even prepared. Due to the complete lack of documentation, figuring out what one of these machines would have looked like is a difficult proposition to say the least. But aside from shamelessly exploiting an interest in exotic German armor for commercial purposes, there are real questions to be asked about what any design could have actually looked like. The primary consideration over what a 15/17cm Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug would have looked like starts with the hull. Obviously, the hull selected was that of the Maus, and given the incredibly tight space in which to operate the mechanisms of the hull, there appears to be no prospect for rearranging the engine, generators, or motor components around the interior. On top of this, any arrangement of drive components would change the shape of the hull and the armor layout to such an extent that this vehicle's hull would be very different to that of the Maus. Given the name is 15/17cm Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug, an assault gun based on a Maus hull, any interpretation of the layout must begin with a look at the Maus hull itself. The Maus hull should be considered as existing in 4 sections. Right at the front, in the very center, is the driver's compartment housing the driver and the radio operator under a single ovaloid hatch. Behind this is a large section for the engine and air intakes for cooling the engine and electric motors. It was on this section that 3 large shell deflectors were fitted to protect the grills. Behind the engine section is the turret area defined by 4 plates cut and welded together to form the opening for the turret basket and ring. More automotive components were below this area too. Finally, at the back, there was another section of grills out of which warm, spent air was forced out, having been drawn through the vehicle to cool the engine. What this layout means is that there can only be one place to mount a casemate for the gun on the vehicle, the area previously occupied by the turret. Removal of the 60mm of hull roof armor and turret ring at this point would provide the space for the casemate, although this would mean that the gun was mounted behind the engine. This was generally not favored for a vehicle as it caused numerous problems, such as access to the engine compartment for maintenance. It would also mean that only a relatively small amount of depression could be achieved over the front of the vehicle. Nonetheless, there was simply nowhere else it could go without a complete redesign of the hull. If the casemate was limited to just the space between the vents on the hull, it would also not be long enough for the enormous cannon breech. Although no drawings of this idea survive, it is perhaps logical to consider that a realistic solution to expelling this air could have been found in a similar manner to that on the Elephant/Ferdinand tank destroyers, by venting air out of the rear of the hull plate under the fighting compartment. but without drawings or a description, this is purely speculative. The next question is the armor of the vehicle, and this is easier to resolve. The armor for the Maus hull is already well documented, and as this was a casemated vehicle, the face of this casemate would have to match or exceed the armor value of the front of the hull, which was about 205mm angled back at 55 degrees. The hull was designed at 200mm, but due to manufacturing tolerances was measured as 205mm in a post-war British examination. Assuming the same basis was to match 200mm at 55 degrees, this would mean an effective armor of about 283mm line-of-sight thickness. Assuming the front of the Maus casemate would match that of the Jagdtiger, probably the best analog of this general design concept, it would require a front plate sloping back at about 15 degrees with about 273mm of thickness, or, at 30 degrees of a plate, 245mm thick. On the Jagdtiger, 250mm at 15 degrees was already more than adequate for the task. It is perhaps more realistic to assume that a rough equivalency to that layout, but with a sloped front, more like the designs adopted by Krupp for the Maus 2 and E100 turrets, would be fitted. Regardless of whether or not the actual armor had ever been fleshed out, the front of the casemate would have been substantially well protected, just as would the sides. The Maus hull sides, in order to meet rail gauge requirements, were 173mm thick and vertical. But the turret sides for the 15cm Sturmgeschütz could not be vertical, as this would prevent it from fitting through railway tunnels. Indeed, the Maus had to have a special rail car designed for it to not only take the weight, but also to lower the height when being shipped by train so it could fit through a tunnel. As the Maus with a turret already was at the limits of the German rail gauge, there was no space for the casemate on top of the Maus hull to get either wider or taller, so therefore must have followed roughly the same dimensions and angles as the turret. That would mean the sides sloping towards the roof at an angle of about 30 degrees, presumably at least the same thickness as the lower sides, 173mm, and possibly as thick of the Maus turret sides, which were 200mm. The rear of the casemate is more complicated, as there is more room to create an overhang for those rear air exhausts. Armor could have been reasonably assumed to be in line with the Maus, as would the roof. The shape and size of the casemate were simply dictated by the limitations of the hull already crammed with the drivetrain, and by the fixed restrictions imposed by the railway gauge. The biggest issue for the design was not the shape or position of the casemate, but the fitting of the gun. There were only two guns in consideration for the Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug, these obviously being the 15 or 17cm cannons. Krupp was adamant that he would do anything to avoid having to use the 17cm gun. That 17cm Sturmkanone, Stuck, assault gun, was 53 calibers long, longer than the 17cm Kanone 18, and is often referenced online as being the same gun planned for the Grille 17, Geschützwagen Tiger für 17cm Kanone 17 Selbstfahrerfette. Although that gun was an L50 rather than the L53 optioned for this design. The 17cm Stuck, L53, existed only on paper as of 22nd of March 1944. It is likely that the reason for Krupp's desire to avoid the 17cm gun was the sheer size of it, as well as the weight being over 7 tons alone, with the length being 9 meters long and having an enormous breech, not to mention very large and heavy ammunition. Mounting and balancing such a heavy gun was no small task, and that is before considerations over the speed of loading in it in the tight confines inside the casemate, a task likely to require at least 2 loaders. The 17cm gun, though, like the 15cm L63, had to meet a specific requirement set in April 1944 by General Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, to be able to defeat up to 200mm of armor at 4,000 meters, leaving no doubt as to a key intended purpose of this vehicle, the destruction of increasingly well-armored enemy tanks at long range. The focus was on this smaller gun, as work had already been done on a 15cm gun mount for the Maus, when that gun was considered more suitable for the delivery of a heavy high-explosive round to destroy concrete gun emplacements, as well as for taking on enemy tanks with an armor-piercing shell. The 15cm Stuck L63 would also be a very large gun, but was at least manageable. Both the E100 and the Maus were planned to be able to mount a 15cm, although the longest 15cm gun contemplated for the Mausturm was the 15cm Kampfwagenkanone L40, the 15cm tank cannon L40. It is likely that neither of the planned guns, either the 15cm L53 or the 15cm L63, were actually made, and so obtaining data on their performance and ammunition can only be inferred from scraps of available data. The gun mounting for that 15cm gun in the Mausturm was internal. That is, the trunnions for the gun were mounted behind the frontal armor of the turret. That turret had a serious design flaw, however, which was highlighted by Krupp, as the bottom half curved downwards and created a shot trap. This was highlighted in May 1943 by Porsche, and the result was that by the time of the Maus 2 turret in March 1944, it was to be replaced with a new, front-sloped turret made from a single flat plate. This would fix the issue of the shot trap, but created a new problem in the sense that the gun trunnion mechanism simply did not fit within the confines of the new turret design, necessitating the movement of the trunnion to said front slope of the turret. Having been forced to copy the dimensions of the previous Maus turret designs, it is reasonable to assume that such a similar system would have been used to mount the 15cm gun. The Maus, Maus 2, and E100 all had primary and secondary cannons, such as the 12.8cm paired with a 7.5cm, but for the 15/17cm Sturmgeschütz, no such arrangement was either needed nor suggested. The Maus had its two guns mounted side by side, which caused enormous problems with space within the turret. One improvement on the Maus 2 was to stack these guns on top of each other, freeing up internal space, albeit at the price of some gun depression. Dropping the requirement for a secondary cannon would significantly free up space within the already cramped casemate. It is also reasonable to assume that an MG-34 machine gun, or possibly even an MG-42, would have been fitted to the casemate itself. Considering German experiences with heavy tank destroyers not being given machine guns, this is probably something they wouldn't have overlooked. Finally, the rangefinder. The Maus was not originally fitted with a rangefinder, but this was improved with the Maus 2 design by means of a 2.1 meter wide, coincidence-type rangefinder across the roof of the turret. Later, this was to be further improved with a slightly narrower, 1.9 to 2 meter wide rangefinder of the same type. There is no doubt that a Sturmgeschütz of this size would have not been fitted with a rangefinder, especially given the 4,000 meter ranges at which it was going to be expected to deliver accurate fire against enemy tanks and structures. Given the common positioning of the rangefinder on the Maus 2 and E100, it is reasonable to assume that a similar arrangement of a similar size and type of rangefinder would have also been used on the Sturmgeschütz. Obviously, it is not possible to determine exactly how many crew would have worked a vehicle of this size, but there is also scope here to consider the number of men needed to operate such a machine. The Maus, for example, required a crew of 6 men, a driver and radio operator in the front of the hull, followed by a commander, gunner, and 2 loaders. Based on the Maus hull, the Sturmgeschütz would be unlikely to have changed the front crew section, as this was fixed into the hull. That would mean the driver and the front radio operator would likely be the same. In the casemate where the turret would previously have sat, the rest of the crew would be situated. This would have to include a commander and a gunner, making for at least 4 crew at a minimum. The gun obviously also required loading, and thus at least 1 loader would have been needed. On the Maus, a second loader was retained as it had 2 cannons and the shells were very heavy, and hauling them around would tire a single loader rather quickly. While the 15/17cm Stugmaus would likely have had no secondary gun to be served by a loader, the 15 or 17cm shells were huge and rather heavy. A unitary one-piece 15cm shell, for example, weighed in excess of 34 kilograms and possibly over 40 kilograms, depending on what ammunition might have been chosen. Moving those shells around would rapidly exhaust a single loader, so a second loader is almost essential just to make the machine viable. This would be aside from any loading assist systems which might have been considered, which theoretically could have reduced the crew to just a single loader. Although the idea of a 15 or 17cm gun using the Maus chassis had failed after a brief spark of interest in May of 1944, with the E100 being selected in preference, it was not much of a loss. The E100 was to suffer the same fate by the middle of July, with Hitler stopping the development of such enormous and heavy weapons. The 15/17 cm Sturmgeschütz auf E100 Fahrzeug joined a long list of failed and abandoned Nazi projects. Because it is not known what the 15/17 cm Stugmaus would have looked like, much of this article has been speculative about the shape and look of the vehicle. No firm drawings were ever even produced, and no initial sketches are known to survive. Nonetheless, the speculation over its appearance is more than just idle chatter, but a serious effort to consider the problems the designers and engineers would have faced and the solutions open to them. At times, such speculative contemplation has been taken to ludicrous extremes by game companies or model makers, but the 15/17 cm Sturmgeschütz auf Mausfahrzeug was still a very real idea. In hindsight, it may have been useless as a weapon and a waste of resources for the German war effort, but the idea was still a relatively novel one and was seriously considered. If you've gotten this far, I thank you for your perseverance. Please leave a like and subscribe to the Tank Encyclopedia YouTube channel. And if you're curious about me, many miles away, there will be a link to my channel in the video description. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.
That's all for this video. Make sure to follow our website, we'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit, and if you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. Also, likes, comments, and subscriptions on YouTube are greatly appreciated. If you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, also consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.